Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Niles Hushka. I'm a partner in Yellowstone Strategies and a member of the board for Montana State Chamber. This last session, and we'll definitely get you out on time to get you over to the Civic Center in the wind. The last session that we have set today is on infrastructure. And as we heard earlier in the presentations, Montana's infrastructure is rated a C by the Civil Engineer Society, which I think is a pretty honest opinion of it. So from a funding mechanism to project prioritization, the way in which stakeholders handle this issue has implications on commerce in Montana. For the Montana Chamber, infrastructure investment is a major objective, and it is part of our 10-year plan, the Envision 2026. As we move forward, we will talk a little bit more about that too. With that in mind, I welcome you to our panel on infrastructure investment. We are very pleased to bring a range of perspective. And we will have a second expert soon. Her plane was delayed. She got to spend a lot of time in Denver today, but we suspect she'll be walking in shortly. And if not, well, Daryl's going to just take care of it for us. So we have, first of all, we have Daryl James. He's a multidisciplinary independent consultant here in Helena and has served as the executive director of the Montana Infrastructure Coalition since its inception. And also, hopefully, when Diane gets here, Diane Parks is a partner at the Dorsey Law Firm. She is co-chair of the firm's public-private partnership industry group and has extensive experience advising clients in infrastructure procurement and project execution. So we'll move forward with these, and I'm going to turn it over to Daryl first and have him make his presentation for us. Thank you, Daryl.
Thanks, Niles. This one live? Very good. I'm going to stand because I tend to fidget and need to move around just to keep myself awake, and I'll try to keep you guys awake as well. And I fully recognize, and I think Bridger did this to me at the last, I think it was the annual meeting, puts me right between you guys and cocktail hour. So I'm not sure what I did to deserve this post, but I'll try to keep you engaged in this conversation and get you out of here on time to move on to the Civic Center. Again, my name is Daryl James. I'm the Executive Director for the Montana Infrastructure Coalition. How many of you are familiar with the Infrastructure Coalition and the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years? Good. I'm going to give you just a real quick overview then of kind of what we are, what we're all about, and a little bit about where we hope to head here in 2019. So the infrastructure, well, I want to talk about what the Infrastructure Coalition is, and then maybe more importantly, what we consider infrastructure to be. If you've been paying attention to the last couple of election cycles, when infrastructure investment became kind of a popular political term, everybody's project then became infrastructure. It didn't matter what it was infrastructure, and it was critical to that community. So we want to talk about how the coalition has come up with a definition for that and what we're really focused on. We're going to talk about the current state of infrastructure. Niles mentioned the ASCE report card. We'll talk a little bit about that. Why it's important to invest in our critical infrastructure in our communities, and then what tools are currently available. So the Infrastructure Coalition really started to come together at the close of the 2015 legislative session. If you're paying attention to discussions over the 13 and 15 legislative sessions, you remember some pretty heated discussions about the bonding bill. It used to be 20, 30 years ago, the bonding bill was that bill that every legislator sought. They wanted to carry that bonding bill to fund critical projects in their communities, frankly, to take that money home and get projects built. That political dialogue changed under the Schweitzer administration when the economy was good, there was cash available, and we adopted a cash on the barrel mentality and said, we're not going to bond, we're going to pay cash. Bonding is bad, we're going to give money back to folks. So it really changed the political dialogue about bonding, and we're having a tough time changing that dialogue today. We'll talk a little bit about the bonding bill and what it's shaping up to look like this session. But at the close of the 15th session, folks like the Montana Chamber and the Contractors Association, architects and engineers, League of Cities and Towns, all got together and said, we've all come at this from our own independent perspectives and said, it's important to invest in infrastructure. We need a bonding bill. We need to spend money on this infrastructure that's failing. The legislature is not understanding the importance, so how do we change the narrative? How do we change that dialogue? So that was really the seed that planted the Infrastructure Coalition. Those groups got together, started a broader conversation. By the spring of 15, we had about 50 people that sat down in Billings and started a brainstorming session about how do we organize ourselves, how do we carry a different message to the legislature, and really carry that message that infrastructure investment is important, and it's a good, sound investment to make sure that Montana is competitive in the regional and international marketplace. So that's how it all started, and we've grown to over 100 different member organizations today. They're public and private companies that are all, or organizations that are all involved in some form of infrastructure, whether they're involved in the engineering, the design, the finance, the construction, the ownership, operation, and maintenance of critical public infrastructure in communities across the state. So we've got a good, broad, diverse group that's at the table, continuing this conversation about how and why we should invest in critical infrastructure in our communities. When we talk about infrastructure, I'm sure you all look at roads and bridges in your neighborhoods, in your communities, and you see potholes, and you say, yeah, those potholes ought to be fixed. Most of us don't think about the infrastructure that lies underneath those streets. Our water sewer systems are sometimes 75 and 100 years old. They're leaking, they're old, they're unsafe. So we know that people are starting to understand a little bit more about the critical state of our infrastructure, but the coalition wants to make sure that the general public and certainly the legislature understands the importance of investing in that infrastructure, making sure that we have sound infrastructure, not only for safe and healthy communities, but to provide the basis for a healthy, strong economy, and making sure that we're competitive, again, with our neighboring states and folks that are looking to locate businesses and families in Montana. The mission of the Infrastructure Coalition really is to serve as a repository of information. We do a lot of our own independent research on methods for project delivery, taxation models, ways to really start building our infrastructure better, making it longer lasting, making sure that we are really using state-of-the-art practices in not only the finance but the construction and ownership, operation, and maintenance of our infrastructure. So we're a nonpartisan group that's really interested in broadening the understanding of infrastructure investment and how we can improve the state in Montana. One of the most important conversations we've had is defining infrastructure. Again, everybody's got their own idea of what's most important and what infrastructure means. The coalition really came up with a simple definition saying that it's tangible facilities and assets that provide the foundation for a healthy community and a vibrant economy. That's still a pretty broad definition, but at least it provides some reasonable sideboards for a detailed and intelligent conversation about what infrastructure is and where we ought to focus our efforts. So how did we identify critical infrastructure? When you look at the infrastructure deficit that we have in the state, it reaches into the billions. So you really have to decide where you're going to start picking apart that deficit and what you're going to start addressing first. We took, I'm going to introduce this concept first. There's really two different types of infrastructure, and this becomes important later in the conversation. There's economic, which is kind of those basic requirements in any community that keeps you economically viable. It's a connected transportation network. It's clean water and power and communication systems. Those are all essential to have any kind of an economy. And then you move into the social aspects, and that's things like human development. It's schools and hospitals and community facilities and those kinds of things. So when we understand that we have a need for both of those, and we understand this broad spectrum of infrastructure needs, everything from roads and bridges to schools and water systems and hospitals and park and recreational facilities and fiber optic cable, it's all important, it's all infrastructure, but where do you start? Knowing that that deficit in providing optimal services and facilities is in the tens of billions of dollars just in Montana, and we've got limited resources, where do you start? So we took Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I've quizzed you before. How many remember Maslow's hierarchy from either undergraduate or high school sociology classes? Only a few of you. That's pretty sad. So we took Maslow's hierarchy, and if you remember, at the base of that pyramid, every civilized society needs basic food, shelter, water, air, right? Basic necessities of life: food, shelter, air, water. So we took a look at that, and then you build up to the social needs and the self-actualization needs. We took the list of critical infrastructure and spread that across Maslow's hierarchy. And at the bottom of that pyramid, we put clean water, sewer, roads, and bridges. So every community, no matter where you are in the state of Montana, really anywhere in the world, you kind of need those 3 or 4 things to have any kind of a real society, right? So you start building on that. You've got power and communications. You got police and fire protection, and you get into the safety things. You move on up into the social aspects, and you've got schools, libraries, city hall, fiber optic, parks and recreation. So as you move up, again, it's not that it's not infrastructure. It's just it's not essential for every single community in the state or in the country to have all of those things. But as you move down that pyramid, it becomes more and more critical to have any kind of a cohesive community and a place where you can attract businesses and families to locate and thrive. Niles mentioned the American Society of Civil Engineers, the ASCE report card. ASCE nationally prepares a nationwide report card on the state of infrastructure. They do this every 4 years. Montana had their last one in 2014. They've just updated it this fall. And we have the new results. Nothing has really changed dramatically from the last report card. Our overall grade point average for infrastructure in Montana is a C to C minus. Roads and bridges are down there in the C minus range. Schools are in the D minus range. Then you move on up into, I can't even read that, but solid waste I think is about a B minus. So we know that our physical state of infrastructure is pretty poor. These grades are based on not just the physical state, but the reliability of the funding source to actually address the needs that are identified. So as we start building more momentum with the legislature and identifying things like a fuel tax increase that will help address our road and bridge deficit, those grades will begin to improve. As we begin to invest as communities in our infrastructure, we may see those grades begin to improve. But one session, one bill is not an answer for the coalition, and it's not an answer for your communities as we start looking at how to really pick off this infrastructure deficit. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We spent the last couple of years talking about the need in our communities. You can see some pictures of some water lines that were replaced here within the last couple of years. There are baseball to softball size holes in these water lines that are leaking underneath the streets in communities all across the state that we don't think about, because once you turn that spigot on and water comes out, well, you've got a good water system. It works just fine. But this is a scene that's repeated all too often across the state, and we know that in areas, certainly in rural Montana, most of these systems haven't been touched in 75 to 100 years. And they were built with about a 50-year intended lifespan. So we're long beyond the intended lifespan of these pieces of infrastructure, and it's becoming critical that we start planning for repair or replacement of most of that infrastructure. We can also look at the need in terms of a fiscal response, and I'm going to talk about this with a different slide. The important thing to think about as we head into the 19th session, though, is we've been talking with the legislature, again, since 2015-16 about infrastructure needs, the deficit, that it's real, it's physical, it's financial. And they finally started telling us earlier in the fall, stop telling us about the need. We get it. What we need are the solutions. And we said, well, that's what we're trying to come up with. That's the dialogue that we're trying to start here. But let's not forget what we're trying to do. That it is a real problem. These aren't made-up projects. It's not pork projects going back to communities. It's addressing real physical needs in everybody's communities in Montana. But how did we get here? One of the things is when you think about infrastructure funding over the last 20 years, 25 years ago, there were huge federal grants. There were earmarks that were coming into the state that addressed substantive infrastructure needs. That money is all but gone. We're seeing a shift literally from 75 down to about 25% of that funding coming from federal sources. So the feds are largely out of the infrastructure funding game. That means all of that burden is on the state. And if you look at a state like Montana, if you were paying attention to that last presentation, most of that tax money that goes to infrastructure is coming from the local property taxpayer. So no money's coming from out of state. All that burden lies on the Montana property taxpayer. When you think about the amount that we're investing as a percentage of GDP, that percentage has been declining over the last 20 years. So we're spending less per percent of GDP than we were 20, 25 years ago. So it's not just that the feds aren't spending it, so we're spending it at the local level. As a percentage of GDP, we're declining in how much we're spending on infrastructure. Then you have to look at the rising cost of labor and materials over the last 20 to 25 years. So we're losing ground on how much we're investing, and that gap just continues to grow because it's more expensive to build. So every year we punt on a bonding bill or significant investment in infrastructure, the larger that gap becomes, the more expensive that infrastructure becomes, and we just get further and further behind. But why is it important to invest in infrastructure? There's clearly the human health and safety issues that we face with roads, bridges, water, sewer. There's safety issues with schools. You go on up that list. There are basic human elements to why we need to invest in infrastructure. There's also the business side of this. There's the need to be connected to markets to make sure that we're able to get goods and services to the markets where there's demand, to make sure that we're able to communicate outside our immediate areas. So there's certainly an economic aspect. There's short and long-term employment opportunities. And then frankly, at the end of this, the need doesn't go away. It just gets more expensive, and the problem just gets larger the longer we continue to wait. I want to talk a little bit about this notion that this is impossible to read, and I don't really intend for you to have to read this chart. But as we started talking about as an infrastructure coalition, all the different funding sources for infrastructure and how those were earmarked for certain types of projects. We know that the fuel tax by the Montana Constitution has to go to roads and bridges. It can't be spent anywhere else. We know that the Coal Tax Trust Fund has a sub-account for the Treasure State Endowment Program. That's the TSEP program. That money is siphoned off and goes towards county bridges and small rural water wastewater projects. We know where that money is going. We consider those to be consistent, reliable flows. They're diminishing in value over time, but we know where it's all going. When you look at the majority of the funding streams that we have today for critical public infrastructure, if you trace it back to the source, the vast majority of that, again, is the burden is on the local property taxpayer. So when we start thinking about how to raise new revenues, how to increase our spending, we're going back to the same folks every single time and saying, we need you to ante up for a new school. We need you to ante up for a new water system. We need you to ante up for improvements at the airport. We've got to find a way to tap new dollars rather than coming back to the same property taxpayer and find ways to invest in our infrastructure that, again, provides a better opportunity for Montana businesses and families in our communities. So when we start talking about the specific agenda for the 2019 legislative session, we came up with several things, just guiding principles for the coalition. One is that we see user fees as being more appropriate than just a broad tax. We want to make sure that one of our coalition members, I don't see him now, kind of coined this term for me and said, let's attach the cost of the improvement to the cost causer. Let's make sure that we've got some direct connection on this infrastructure investment. So let's look at that user fee approach rather than just broad taxes. We've got 12 million people that come to the state of Montana every year. We've got a great tourism economy, but they pay a little bit in a bed tax and they pay a little fuel tax, but they pay for virtually none of the rest of their impact on our infrastructure, whether it's the water and sewer system that they use when they're in a hotel or a VRBO. They have an impact on our traffic. They have an impact on the rest of our infrastructure that we bear the cost of when they go home. So we want to make sure that we're able to tap that tourism economy somehow just to account for their impact on what we have to offer them as a visitor. We need to provide some kind of assistance to areas that are declining and can't pay for some of the improvements that are required in their communities. When I think about the role of state government in infrastructure, it doesn't make intuitive sense to me that the state would come in and build a new water system for Helena, right? The Helena taxpayer ought to pay their way in paying for that new water system. But when you look at a small, declining rural community, it's maybe got a population of a couple thousand people, and their water system is failing. They can't meet nutrient standards. they have to upgrade that system. They could be looking at a $20 to $30 million water sewer system upgrade. You can't spread that cost on 2,000 ratepayers in a small community. So you start thinking, well, the state really does have a responsibility to step up and cover that gap. So we need to look at ways to make sure that every community in Montana can remain competitive. That again, that local ratepayer, that local taxpayer doesn't have to bear that complete burden on covering those kinds of costs that are largely driven by regulatory controls that they have no influence over. We want to make sure that we give local authority tools to the growth areas in the state. When we look at an area like Bozeman that's bursting at the seams, the Flathead has experienced similar growth. The increased rates and the cap on property taxes at half the rate of inflation averaged over 3 years really does limit the ability of local governments to keep up with growth, explosive growth in some of our communities. So we need to provide new or additional tools for those growth areas to be able to catch up and sustain decent infrastructure when the infrastructure needs are outpacing the revenue sources. I talked a little bit about the regulatory burdens that we face. We started as a coalition looking into this about a year or so ago and really trying to dial in where these costs are coming from. We spent some time over in Billings where there's, Dan, what's the cost on that water treatment system in Billings? Do you know the number off the top of your head? I want to say it's in the
about 65.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. It's about a 60, I couldn't see you over there. Thanks, Chris. About a $65 million water treatment system. State-of-the-art, great system, room for growth. But if that system were to try to meet all of the new effluent standards, it would be about a $200 million water treatment system. You would essentially be able to take the water that's coming out of the back end of that wastewater treatment plant and put it right into the drinking water system. Doesn't make intuitive sense to me, but you start thinking about the regulatory requirements and the burden we're putting on Montana taxpayers. And at some point, I think we need to revisit some of these requirements and these standards that are coming out of Washington. It wasn't something we were prepared to take on as a coalition this session in starting to talk with DEQ. DEQ has assured us that they are working with small communities that are facing multi-million dollar projects that are just unsustainable in their own communities and providing them with additional time frames to try to meet those standards. Frankly, in hopes of kicking the ball down the field far enough that maybe those standards change and they don't have to meet the increasing standards. But it's an issue that will continue to be out there and that the coalition will start taking a harder look at in the next several months. And then, frankly, one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is defending what's working. We've heard a lot of consternation about the fuel tax increase that we pushed through last session. I think if you look at your experience at the pump, I think the increase that was passed has been barely noticeable. When you look at the trend, both at the state level and the national level, the fuel tax increase that we have in Montana is barely noticeable in the fluctuation of the fuel price itself. And if you look at the price before that fuel tax went into place back in 17 and now, we're on the same trend line with North Dakota, Wyoming, and the national average, and you just simply don't see that increase. There's been a lot of calls for repeal of that gas tax or modification of that gas tax, and we will do all we can to make sure that it stays in place as is, at least until 2023 when it matures, and then we can revisit whether it's either still necessary or needs additional refinement to make sure that we're able to effectively invest in our road and bridge system. So when we start thinking about 19 priorities, one of the things that we want to make sure that we are focused on is meaningful and sustainable investment in critical infrastructure. I think we've effectively defined critical infrastructure as the base level of that pyramid. I think folks understand generally what we're talking about there. It's the essential public infrastructure in every community. We're not talking about rail lines. The rail lines are significantly invested in, and it's actually a figure I want to start pulling together. I saw a figure a couple of years ago, BNSF and Northwestern Energy. When you look at the amount of money that they invest in their own infrastructure, it oftentimes dwarfs what we're doing as an entire state in some of our public infrastructure. So the private sector understands the need for and the value of investing in infrastructure to make sure that it's safe and that it's competitive. And I think we need to make sure we're doing the same thing when we're talking about providing essential services to all of Montana's citizens. I talked about maintaining the fuel tax as a user fee. This is always a really easy topic when we start talking about capping the coal trust. I talked to a couple of Democrat legislators last session about just the notion of saying, what if we capped the coal trust? So you cap the new revenue coming into the coal trust at, say, $1 billion, $1.2 billion, whatever the magic figure is. Anything new is put into a new subtrust that builds its own corpus, and then you start drawing the interest off of that to fund an infrastructure program. And the legislators I talked to said, Darrell, it's a great idea, but it's been signed in blood somewhere in a book that we will never bust the trust. We're not going to touch it. And you can't even talk about you're not busting it. We're talking about capping it. The money still stays there. Any discussion around the coal trust has become a political third rail in the state of Montana. You hear the term that it's been set aside for kind of a rainy day. It's a fund for future generations. And I think it's time for us to start talking about whether now is the future generation that needs to start looking at leveraging that coal trust to make sure that we're getting everything out of it that we can without depleting it for future generations, but certainly leveraging it more effectively than we are today. Easy discussion. Public-private partnership, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that if and when Diana gets here. If not, then I might wing it. We'll see. Last session, we introduced a public-private partnership bill. Just before the transmittal break, we were very focused on the fuel tax bill. We got kind of balled up in some confusion about what a public-private partnership is, what it ought to be, what should be included in the bill, and what shouldn't be included in the bill. And ultimately, it died on the House floor in kind of a fun little political exercise. But we decided as a coalition, and the chamber really took the lead this time around, to retool that and figure out exactly what we need to do with a P3. And I'll kind of lead it up if Diana gets here, and if not, I'll go into that in more detail here in a minute. I'm going to skip bonding bill for a second and go to the statewide sales tax. Whenever we start talking about, again, increased infrastructure investment, and with the understanding that every time we talk about needing to spend more on roads and bridges and water, sewer, and schools, every time we do that, we're coming back to you, the local property taxpayer. How do we leverage more money from somebody else that's using our infrastructure? And I keep coming back to those 12 million visitors. Well, you can't do anything until you have some other tool like a statewide sales tax. That used to be in Montana, again, one of those political third rails. You can't talk about a sales tax. We pride ourselves on not having a sales tax. Politicians on both sides will stand up very early in campaigns and pledge to never introduce a sales tax. But as I've traveled the state over the last couple of years, I've polled every audience on whether they think it's time to have a serious discussion about a statewide sales tax, and I'm going to test you. I get a very similar response. How many think it's time to have a serious discussion about a statewide sales tax? Overwhelmingly, Montanans are ready, but our legislature still thinks that it's taboo, that we can't have the discussion. I've had legislators on both sides say, Darrell, it's time to do this, but have you thought about a ballot initiative? They don't want to bear the responsibility for introducing that sales tax idea. So we as a business community, we as members of our communities need to start impressing the legislature that some form of a statewide sales tax discussion needs to start happening. I might suggest that our experience with the local option sales tax that we introduced last session might be a good starting point. What we looked at there was a modification of a very successful sales tax in Montana, and that's the resort tax. It's a very narrowly defined tax on luxury items, things like hotels, restaurants, bars, outfitters, things that are outside of a normal, average Montanan's everyday purchase. So it's not cars, it's not appliances, it's not groceries or medicine, but it's a narrow range of identifiable products and services that are typically tourism, recreation, luxury type purchases. You can get all balled up in the weeds on that list, but it's a good starting point. Then you make sure that the revenues raised are directed towards a specific outcome. In our case, we were looking for infrastructure investments. So all that revenue would be directed towards roads, bridges, water, sewer, stormwater. And then a later concept was, or other critical infrastructure needs as defined by the community upon a local vote. So we had a relatively decent tool put together. One of the most critical pieces of this, though, was at least 25% of the revenues would be distributed back in property tax relief. And that's something that seems to resonate with a lot of Montana voters and taxpayers, is saying, I'm not too keen on the idea of another tax, but if you're going to give me some relief on either income or property tax, then that's a game changer, and that's a good place to start the conversation. That's what's been happening in Whitefish with their implementation of the resort tax. It's been wildly successful. They've invested in infrastructure. They've provided significant property tax relief, and they voted that tax back on themselves at least 3 times, if not 4 times now. So it's a good model to look at. Maybe that's a good place to start a conversation about a statewide sales tax. Is maybe first and foremost is what kind of property tax relief is involved. If we're able to tap the money coming in the state from 12 million visitors, how can we reduce the burden on the Montana property taxpayer first? And then where does that money go? We don't want to see it disappearing into the general fund. I want to see tangible benefits in my community. So I think that's a good place to start the conversation. It won't happen this session, but again, in your conversations with your representatives at the legislature, I hope you would encourage them to start thinking along those lines, and maybe we can start changing that dialogue a little bit. I want to end with the bonding bill, just in kind of our presentation here. You know, it seems that the bonding bill has become the last ball on the field the last several cycles, and we've ended up with the same result over and over again. And it seems this session is shaping up. I've taken phone calls from a number of folks over the last couple of weeks on what should and shouldn't be included in the bonding bill. So I think we're going to start the conversation again this session where it's ended over the last couple of cycles. Hopefully we can actually get something done this session. The Infrastructure Coalition itself is really focused again on what we've defined as critical infrastructure. It's that core level of publicly owned infrastructure that every community has to have. There will undoubtedly be other projects that will be included in the bonding bill. As long as it doesn't detract from what our goal is, we will support those efforts. But the moment that it appears that anything in that bonding bill will be weighing it down to where we can't get something done, the coalition is committed to making sure that, as we said in 15, we cannot see another session go by without investing in Montana's basic critical infrastructure across Montana. So with that, I will say thank you, and then maybe I'll go into Diana's, unless you've got. Absolutely, you got the notes. Fantastic. Let me kind of get the lead in here, and then I'll on the public-private partnership. How many are familiar at all with the concept of a public-private partnership? Okay, so the idea here is to leverage private investment into building and sometimes maintaining or operating public infrastructure. It's been used in a number of cases where the project has its own consistent revenue stream. So it can be used for student housing or a parking structure. It's even been used in Arizona for water treatment systems or water delivery systems. So where there's a rate or a rental or some kind of a fee associated with the operation and maintenance of that facility, that private investor or developer is basically repaid their costs, with an add-on fee over a period of time, and then that piece of infrastructure is turned over to the local governing authority. It's been a very effective tool around the country. I think there's 17 to 19 states that have pretty broad enabling legislation. There were folks in Montana back in 16 that were interested in trying to implement some kind of a P3 partnership. And I think we found out that we didn't know if we could do it. So we talked about, well, let's put a piece of legislation in that would at least clarify that we're able to do this. But it was confusing and not widely understood on how it was supposed to work. Who has the liability? What happens if it doesn't meet design standards? And there were too many open-ended questions. So we sat down. The chamber really started the conversation within the last 6 or 8 months to say, how do we change the discussion a little bit and focus more on what we're trying to do is just leverage that private investment. How do we get private investors to come in and move the ball a little bit? So we looked at the success, again, of something that we've already done in Montana. Contractors, the chamber, architects and engineers, several years ago worked with the legislature and enabled the Department of Transportation to do design-build contracts, particularly in emergency situations and in very large-scale projects. MDT has delivered a number of projects now through that design-build legislation. And when we look at that model, which involves heavy private investment and input early on in the process, it looks like a good starting point, a good building platform to start leveraging monies for other types of projects. So what Dorsey Whitney is working on is some legislation that would basically just enhance an existing tool in statute that we've had some success with, and just open those doors a little bit more broadly to other types of infrastructure projects. With that, Niles, I'll turn it over to you in the notes.
Thank you. I really appreciate that Diana sent us out notes, so we do have something to talk about a little further. So I'll give you a little background for me too. So I'm a civil engineer. I was the CEO for KLJ many years. We participated in design build and PPM, private partnerships, across the region. We were a regional firm, had offices in a number of states, and did a lot of different work. So I'm now retired. So to talk about a little further, I want to talk about two differentiations. First of all, there's a delivery method that we're talking about, and then there's a financing method. It's very important to keep those two separated. The delivery method is how you make the project come to fruition. And traditionally, for for projects that came from public financing, it had to be design, bid, build. So a design was put together, a bid was asked for from contractors, and then there was a build process. And then there's a number of variations to that have come along for how do you do project delivery. So the next form of project delivery that came out was when we would call it design build, but it's a big word, but what it basically meant is that a design build process is that you involve the engineer/designer and the contractor immediately in the design process, so they work together to make sure that the product is delivered in a different fashion. And in a design build process, it's one of the criteria is to have have reasonable project costs, but in most cases the low bidder is not selected. The low bidding is not a criteria because you're looking for value. And that's the one side of what we do now. So that's called project delivery. Now, if we go to the other side and say project financing, that's just as wide open of an animal today, too. Each state has a different set of regulations that they operate under. And basically, you go to an entity and you say to that entity, we would like you to build a water treatment facility, operate it for the next 25 years, as Daryl mentioned, and then turn it over to us when it's complete. And in the meantime, you get to make a little bit of profit that we negotiate with you during the process, and hopefully it's done in a different fashion. Now, the real key to project delivery based on a partnership model is that the hope was in the industry is because the entity has to not only build it, but operate it and maintain it, is that they would do a better job of building and operating it so that the product had a better long-term life. So that was the hope of this legislation, and oftentimes it comes true, and of course with everything else sometimes it doesn't. What this legislation is, I'm going to read now off notes, so please forgive me. It's basically being attached to the Alternative Project Delivery Contracts legislation as it goes forward. The bill looks at adding innovative financing delivery options to the existing legislation to include mechanisms to allow public projects to utilize private participation in financing operations and maintaining the public project as a means for the public entity to provide a needed public asset with limited resources. A long statement that basically says if you can't afford it, this is another method that you can go forth to use private funding for. Again, yes, there is a bit of profit that comes forth with that, but that's how these things go forward. The key was, and Daryl mentioned this too, is that it's a very comprehensive agreement. It does talk about and try to negotiate a fixed price during the process of project delivery, but more importantly, there's a fixed price on turnover. There's a duration, there's risk transfer and calculations that go into it, there's relief mechanisms for events that are out of normal control, and then there's a distribution of other types of financial and private party right liability issues. It's a comprehensive agreement that involves, as we talked about, project delivery, project maintenance, project operation, and then what do you turn over? So you don't get to run its life out and turn up something that has no value to it. It still ends up in long-term value. In addition to the criteria for project delivery for contracts, it also, the legislation requires that it has to have a demonstrated public purpose, and that demonstrates that value for money analysis factors into the innovative financing contract method, but it's not the only selection criteria. So yes, cost is a factor. It has to. When utilizing an innovative financial delivery option, a public entity shall follow procurement guidelines along with all applicable rules and regulations regarding competitive public procurement under the current Montana law. So it doesn't change those requirements. Award of the comprehensive agreement is based on best value. So again, that's back to what happens in some cases anyways. And I'll go to say, so my history comes from engineering. That's how you select your engineer normally for any federal or state project. You solicit proposals. You go through an RFP, request for proposals. The firms come in and compete and tell you what they're going to do, how they're going to deliver value to you. And then once that value is analyzed, the entity selects the individual engineering/architect firm to do the work. And once that's done, a scope is negotiated and a fee is determined. So it's not cost competitive, it's value competitive, and that's what this legislation is trying to drive. Under the legislation, there's a minimum solicitation process that's involved that includes an innovative financial delivery. Then there's an analysis based on cost, benefits, risk transfers, and the innovative financial delivery method. I will just skim over some of these. We talked about them. It still follows through with the same criteria for construction. There's a detailed schedule, and there are detailed construction plans that are developed and approved by the entity. Detailed financial plans and financial modeling for the lifetime of the asset need to be presented and agreed to. A list of utilities and right-of-way that will be impacted for the project is part of these analysis. The permitting and governmental approvals come through the independent PP or private partnership, and a plan for any relocation of those assets or additional right-of-way is also included. Some additional public provisions that are being looked at. The first one is to create a public debt secured by pledge of the tax-paying power for the responsible public entity through comprehensive agreement as a general obligation. So that means that when this private partnership is negotiated and it goes forward, the entity is still obligated in the long term. It's a general commitment too. It's not committed to a specific revenue source or something else. The legislation requires a general obligation. It exposes the public entity in indebtedness liability from the third party, which means claims from negligence during construction or other parts of operation resolved with the third party. It does expose the public entity to the indebtedness as a liability, of course, in the long term. Requires the public entity to provide compensation to the private entity for forced events, and it provides for comprehensive agreements and how you reach those agreements during the process of it. And there's a number of other technical requirements in it. So the legislation, again, is being prepared by Darcy Whitney, and it actually opens up the prospect of going forward with two things. Again, alternate delivery and alternate financing for long-term asset utilization by a public entity. So I stole the minutes, and we have Bridget's giving me the thumbs up and saying you got to get some questions quickly. So I won't answer any questions on this legislation. Maybe Darrell will. But any questions?
Not a question so much as a comment. David Smith from the Montana Contractors Association. And we did have conversations with the director of the Highway Department, and one of the things that would be another third rail, just like a sales tax, would be toll roads. And the Highway Department has said that they are very happy to not have toll roads be part of that equation.
That's why we didn't bring it up. Thanks. No, actually, it's an important. Exactly. It is an important consideration because when folks read the bill last session, they said, well, this could apply to toll roads. It's like, well, theoretically, maybe it could, but you really can't build a toll road in Montana and expect you're going to pay for it unless you're charging like $150 for every time you pass over that bridge. So it's really not applicable in Montana. It was never intended to be, but it became a sticking point for a lot of folks last session. So thanks for the comment. You know, Joe, it's a good question, and I think we do take that data from the Institute of Tourism and what is it over miles at the U of M? Thank you. Joe, I think when you look at, particularly with the big cattle trucks coming out of Calgary and heading through the state, and it's different over in the eastern part of the state, the fuel tax paid is not based on where they pay it. It's particularly for commercial truck traffic. They pay on a per mile basis. So they pick a route and they pay their tax based on the lane miles they travel through Montana. So that's a different deal. I think when you look at emplanements and hotel rooms and that kind of thing, that's probably a better predictor of actual tourism in Montana. I think the visitorship at our national parks, those are good, reliable figures. And frankly, from my perspective, when I'm talking about impact on infrastructure, I really don't care if that person comes from Calgary or San Francisco or Butte. If they're traveling and using that infrastructure, there's a cost associated with that, and we need to figure out how to tap that. And I think the fact that there's, even if it is, let's just say it's 4 million, that's 4 times the residents that we have, and it's a much larger pot of money that they're used to paying that everywhere else they go, everywhere else they live. I think it makes sense to start talking about some way to, you don't get to ask another one. All right.
Sales tax for like Memorial Day and Labor Day, has that ever been done in any state? Just to capitalize on the summertime?
Not that I've ever heard of. But it's, yeah. I've not heard of a seasonal tax or, I think if you put it on the right stuff, I think that's probably the more direct way to tax than not. And I think you probably start getting into some interstate commerce type stuff as well. Chris?
So, Darrell, interesting that in Virginia City they do it seasonally. I'm not suggesting it's what we should do to solve our issue, but with the in-state local option, there's a city doing the seasonal, and then there's a city as small as, I think, population 52, Craig, Montana, who's found that it's worked quite well for them. So,
but that's with our resort tax. Yeah. Okay.
Any burning final questions?
Somebody has to have a hard one. Come on. Over here, Bridger.
Oh. Yes.
As it relates to the non-resident data, how a lot of that is collected is actually based on somebody literally standing there and they're targeting cars. They're not talking to the truck drivers of the world. They're actually sitting there at a entrance to the state or a gas station or a grocery store at a attraction, and they're looking at a car with a family or a person, and they're going up and they're talking to that person. They're actually not even surveying trucks or residents or anything else. They're very much targeting that leisure traveler. And of course, there's enplanements and some of the other flight data, but it's pretty specific. Norma and her crew at ITRR are very specific about what kind of data they're pulling.
Good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Alvin Windy Boy. I am the CEO of iResponse, a consulting firm in Rocky Boy, Montana. I also am a rancher, and most recently my son inherited some land on Fort Belknap, a lot of land. And what I kind of find astonishing is I served on the state grasslands board for about 8 years. And what I find amazing is the AUMs that are paid by Indian ranchers on reservations is anywhere between $17 to $24 an AUM. And sitting on state lands and also BLM lands, rates are really low. Why couldn't the Chamber of Commerce of Montana apply or ask a question on why that is? The other thing that I don't know how true this is, on the unemployment rates on the 7 reservations, how does that apply to the numbers here in the state of Montana? Or how reflective is it? Or is it a part of it?
I can't address that from an infrastructure standpoint. I think that's probably a discussion with Bridger and the chamber in a separate discussion. But I will address something though in the disparity in infrastructure on our reservations versus some of our smaller communities. And it is something that we need to take a harder look at as a state and what role the state has in participating there. Certainly in assisting with that or augmenting what BIA does.
Anybody else?
Other
Maybe we
questions?
should let folks get ahead of
I think
rush
they're
hour
thirsty,
traffic.
Bridger.
Yeah. All right. Good enough. Let's wrap it up, Niles. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon and especially sitting through our last conference here. We greatly appreciate all of your time. And then I was asked to remind everyone again that bus will be starting at 5:30 from right out front here at the Great Northern, and it'll just run in a continuous loop, bringing you back and forth to the Civic Center. So keep that in mind. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.